I have always been fascinated by pruning. I prune my fruit trees, and I've even experimented with pruning tomatoes, but never in a very disciplined fashion. Well, this spring I was perusing the scientific literature on pruning tomatoes, and I was a little confused by the results. Some researchers find that pruning increases the yield or quality of the tomatoes. Others find that it has really no effect. So this summer I decided I was going to take matters into my own hands. I was going to perform a disciplined, controlled, rigorous experiment in my backyard with pruning tomatoes. And the results have totally blown me away. Couple of notes first before I dive into what my data were and how to do this. You can only prune indeterminate varieties of tomatoes. These are tomatoes that set flowers and fruit and ripen their fruit all season long. Indeterminate varieties of tomatoes basically yield a continuous stream of fruit until it either frosts and kills them or the day length becomes too short. My favorite indeterminate variety of tomatoes is Purple Cherokee, and that's what I used this year. So in terms of my data, I had two groups of tomato plants. I had one group of 9 plants that were unpruned, and then I had another group of 9 plants that were pruned. I pruned these using the sucker method. I'm going to show you in this video how I did that, but you can of course look it up. The conditions between the two plots of tomatoes were identical soil, identical light, identical watering regime, identical nutrients, identical everything. It was just that one group I pruned and the other one I didn't. So let me show you the data. So the unpruned tomatoes produced 23.4 kilograms. That's around 50 pounds of tomatoes. And the pruned group of tomatoes produced 32 kilograms. That's around 70 pounds. Now that difference all by itself, around 9 kilograms or 20 pounds, that's telling all by itself. But it's an even bigger deal once I ran a chi-square analysis of the data and found that that difference was very significant. So for this experiment, my critical t-value was 2.120, and the t-statistic that my data gave me was 24.579. So these are hugely significant data. It's not just that one looks bigger than the other. One is actually statistically bigger than the other. So we can conclude that my pruning of these tomatoes had a really significant positive impact on the growth of the tomatoes. What I did not do, I did not count the tomatoes per plant. I wish I had. That would have helped me to triangulate a little bit more what the effect of pruning was. But in terms of total yield, the results are huge. So the tomatoes on the north side of the garden, I'm going to let them grow wild. And then the tomatoes on the south part of the garden, I'm going to prune them. And the way that I'm going to prune them is a specific technique called sucker pruning. And I'll show you how to do that right now. So sucker pruning is really easy to do. And so what I'm showing you on the screen right now, this is a sucker. It's a little baby vine that's emerging from between the central stem and a little axial stem right here. And what this sucker will do is over the course of the season, it will grow and it will try to bear fruit. But you can see these plants are really well established. It's about mid-July. And so this little branch, the sucker, if it produces fruit at all, they're probably going to be small and they're probably not going to have time to ripen because we're going to get our first frost by the time that these are good to go. So the idea behind sucker pruning is that you remove as many of these suckers as you can by around the time that fruit starts to set, so that any fruit that are on your plants have a lot of time to ripen. The plant can dedicate those resources to getting those tomatoes big and ripened, and it won't waste resources trying to grow out branches and produce fruit that probably won't have time to ripen in the first place. As soon as you start to see your fruit setting, so I've got a lot of tomato production here. I also have some nice fruits which are beginning to develop. I'm ready to start cutting these suckers. I probably could have done this a week or two ago, and it would have been fine, because the minute you start seeing fruit setting, you should start getting rid of these. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove this sucker. I have a very sharp, clean blade, so I've sanitized this with some alcohol. And I'm just going to go ahead and really carefully get in there with my thumb and the blade and kind of just pop it off, and then just discard it, just get rid of it. And I'm going to do this with as many suckers as I can that I can find on the plant, and try to catch them when they're a little on the smaller side, like that one. If you see larger ones, larger suckers that are starting to grow, that might cause a bit more injury to the plant. But like here's one right here that I don't want, so I'm going to get rid of that guy. I'm going to try really hard not to cause unnecessary injury to the plant as I'm cutting these suckers out. Right here is a sucker that probably won't amount to anything, so I'll get rid of this guy. This is kind of a bigger one, so again, this little sort of a nascent branch, which is showing up in between the main stem and a little axial side stem here. Just give that a little snip. It's good. So I'm going to very carefully prune this half of the tomatoes in this garden, these 9 plants, and then record the yield that they produce and anything else that seems relevant. And we're going to see if my results seem to indicate whether pruning is a benefit or a liability for tomatoes. So let's see if pruning my tomatoes helps to improve anything. So if you ask me, the jury has delivered a verdict. Pruning tomatoes can have a pretty significant impact on their yield. I also found, just based on my own casual observations, that the pruned tomatoes were no less healthy or less vigorous than the unpruned ones. So it didn't seem to me like pruning them caused the introduction of disease or unnecessary trauma to the plant. I did find that the unpruned tomatoes were a bit less disciplined in their growth. They really did just grow all over. They were flopping over the tomato cages by the end of the season. And so there was just a lot of sort of dangling elbows and things like that from my unpruned plants. The pruned ones were a little bit, better kempt and just looked a little bit less crazy. But the big difference is that 30-40% increase in yield that I got when I pruned the tomatoes. So what that means is that I'm going to continue pruning my indeterminate varieties of tomatoes. I think as far as extending this research into the coming years, I will probably experiment with other varieties of indeterminate tomatoes. I love my Purple Cherokee tomatoes, but the research does seem to indicate that the variety of tomatoes you use does have some effect on the efficacy of pruning. So that's something that maybe I could look forward to in the future. But if you want my recommendation, I would say try pruning them. Just go ahead and try it yourself and see what you get. It's going to depend on your variety and it might depend on your conditions, but it worked for me and maybe it'll work for you.